Okay. So what's happening right now is I'm waiting to see how many viewers join us. Okay, and it looks like we have one viewer. So I'm going to wait for a few minutes until a few more viewers join us before we get started. And we're now up to 3 viewers, so just waiting a little bit longer for people to join. I think I'll probably wait for another 2 or 3 minutes before we get started with this presentation. And if you've just joined us, we're just waiting for a couple of minutes to allow people some time to get online, and then we'll get started. But we already have both of our speakers for the online dialogue, Bruno and Diana, with us. I'll be introducing them shortly. And thanks everybody for your patience. I know a few of you have heard me say this already. We're just waiting for 1 more minute and then we'll get started. Okay, so thanks everybody for joining us for this online dialogue that links to the Build Peace Conference. For those of you who don't know the Build Peace Conference, it's an annual event that brings together people to talk about technology, peace building, arts, and research. And we're delighted to have today with us 2 of the speakers who will be at the Build Peace Conference in Zurich on September 9th and 11th for an initial online dialogue to share their thoughts on a question that is very relevant to the program of the conference. So they'll be talking about what transformation means in peace building and what transformation means in technology. So with us we have Bruno Siqueira, who's a graduate of computer science from the Universidade Federal Fluminense and has a master's degree in software engineering from Pontificia Universidad Católica de Rio de Janeiro. At Pontificia Universidad Católica, he discovered his passion for agile methodologies and for the open source community. There he worked in 2 laboratories, TechGraph and the Laboratorio de Ingeniería de Software. He has worked for 12 years in system development and software management, and he's the founder of the website Amizade Positiva, a social network focused on people living with chronic diseases, where they can exchange information with others living with the same condition. He's currently at Instituto Igarapé, where he works as a software developer and analyst on a few different projects, including the Smart Policing, the Children's Security Index, and the Homicide Monitor. So we're very excited to have Bruno here to share his thoughts. And along with Bruno, we have Diana Chigas, and Diana is the co-director of the collaborative learning at CDA and a professor of the practice of international negotiation and conflict resolution at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. At CDA, Diana works with governmental and non-governmental institutions on systemic conflict analysis, strategic planning, and reflection and evaluation to improve the impact of peace programming. Diana was a contributor to the recent OECD DAC guidelines on evaluation of conflict prevention and peace building, and to guidance for DFID on evaluation of peace building and conflict sensitivity. Her current focus includes understanding cumulative impacts of peace building, understanding how business contributes to peace, and developing new instruments for evaluation of peace building and conflict sensitivity. Prior to joining CDA, Diana worked as a facilitator, trainer, and consultant in negotiation, dialogue, and conflict resolution at Conflict Management Group, a non-governmental organization founded by Harvard Law School professor Roger Fisher. Her work included development of strategies, training, and advice on preventive diplomacy in the OSCE, Track 2 discussions in El Salvador, South Africa, Georgia, and facilitation of inter-ethnic dialogue in Cyprus. So we're delighted to have both Diana and Bruno here. They're going to each start by giving us their thoughts on this question about transformation in peace building and transformation in technology. And after they have each made an intervention, we'll open it up for questions from you, from the audience, and I might ask a few questions of them as well. So Diana, without further ado, the floor is yours.
So good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. So thank you for being here. Bruno and I have had a great time actually preparing for this and talking across what sometimes could be considered silos. So it's been great even preparing for this. I thought I started in this field in the late 1980s and entered into a, I suppose one could call it a terminology conflict, or passionate debates about the terminology of conflict management, resolution, transformation. And it's been resolved, but I think it's instructive in thinking about transformation. So there was conflict management, and I, working with Roger Fisher at the time, was a term I was associated with, and with the idea that you could develop the capacity to resolve not just this dispute, one dispute, but future ones constructively. And those who were proponents of conflict resolution and the terminology of conflict resolution said, well, we object to the conflict management. It sounds like you're papering things over. You really have to deal with underlying fundamental issues and basic human needs, such as identity, security, recognition, dignity, and those are non-negotiable. And unless you deal with that, there will continue to be conflict. And then comes conflict transformation, which is a term that really became to be used by John Paul Lederach in the late 1980s. And who started to say, well, what we're doing is actually beyond conflict resolution, because you really can't resolve conflict. You can resolve disputes, you can't resolve conflict, but you need to start seeing everything much more as a whole that has immediate problems, that has underlying patterns, and really work on developing and evolving the quality of the relationship. And not only that, it's not just about solving problems, but it's also about building a future, a more positive future, and envisioning experience conflict as a positive force for growth and change. So we were in the sort of storm of this for the first years of my career, and of course the debate has been settled. Conflict transformation is increasingly used as common terminology in both practitioner and academic circles, but I think the debates are reflective of the way we've come to understand conflict transformation in the peace-building field. And there is somewhat of a consensus that was confirmed by the Reflecting on Peace Practice program that I ran just before I became this at CDA. And looking at a few things that about, and I will talk about just some of the elements and then some of the dilemmas as a practitioner and sort of putting them into practice. First, it's about relationships and about relationships between human beings, also between citizens and the state, but really about the quality of relationships between human beings. It is concerned about immediate situations, so the conflict management and dispute resolution is relevant. It is concerned about stopping and ending violence, but it's also concerned with people's capacity to deal with conflict constructively. Skills, relationships, attitudes, structures that allow people to do that. And it's concerned with building, and when we surveyed people in the Reflecting on Peace practice research that we did and asked people sort of to define peace, people talked about building a just and sustainable peace beyond ending violence. So it's more than ending violence, but addressing underlying patterns of relationships like exclusion, security, and building change processes that increase justice and allow for human growth. And it occurs at many levels. So I think there's a fair amount of consensus. Maybe I'm being too bold in saying that, in the field around these kinds of broad concepts. What does that mean in practice? And I'll speak through my own experience as a practitioner in the 90s and early 2000s, and then as leading the Reflecting on Peace Practice program at CDA, which was looking at, in a collaborative way, learning about effectiveness of peace building from the field and from practitioners. And I'll frame this as questions because I learned two things early on in my career. One, that there's no one right answer to anything. And you can't really be effective if you're asking, what can I do to be effective? What can I do? And where is there a need for me to do what I do best? But more, what does the situation need? How do we understand the situation? And is there a role for me? So there's no one right answer. It's really contextual. And nothing is predictable. Dynamics are constantly changing. I saw this in Cyprus, where I've been working there for almost 20 years. Every year I had a different quote-unquote landmine. Something else went wrong that was sometimes predictable, but sometimes not very predictable. So conflicts are there are commonalities, but they're also very particular and changing and evolving. So I see this as sort of questions that we're constantly dealing with. A first question is, and I say this really from my own experience because I spent many, many years bringing people together for dialogue, for training on really building capacities and building sort of spaces where people could communicate and begin to understand each other and build relationships. And I saw tremendous stories of personal transformation in people's relationship to their own experience, in the relationships they built with each other and their capacity to work together, and tremendous energy, a source of action, hope to work for change. But then I started asking after about 10 years, so as a friend of mine always says, so what? And so how do you build that? How do you work on that direct interaction and capacity for personal transformation and at the same time address structural and systemic change? And what we found at RPP also, which was very consistent with my own experience, is sometimes those are divorced. There's a lot of transformation at the personal level, at the individual level, around attitudes and skills, but it's hard to translate into structural and systemic change and work on those at the same time. So that seems to be, you need to do both. You need to link them both if you want to look at sort of broader transformation. So that is something that I think is a dilemma and something where you go back and forth in the field. How do you also then, a second issue, there's an urgency of work where there's violence. People come in where there's violence, where there's impending violence or reoccurrence of violence. But transformation, if you really look at the underlying patterns and the underlying patterns of relationships, really is a very long-term thing. It's not going to happen in a matter of months or years, even sometimes it's generations, to address some of these underlying dynamics. So how do you work on addressing these urgent issues of ending violence and impending violence, while also putting in place processes to address some of these underlying dynamics. And what we see often in the field is as things calm down, resources leave, so it's much harder for people to work on this. And sometimes then when we're working on shorter term issues, it's much harder. We put into place structures that make it then harder to work on some of these longer term issues. And again, that's a sense, there's no one right answer, but it's certainly something that as practitioners, when we think about transformation, we need to think about that long-term perspective, even if we're working in the short term. A third issue I used to call the peace writ little, peace writ large issue. I worked, and many of us work with small groups. We work in communities, local communities. We work with in a specific sector, and we can do a lot, and we see a lot of change happening in that particular sort of sector. How do you connect it with the larger dynamics? How do you know, and how do you strategize about having what you're doing and the good that we're doing in our sort of domain contribute to adding up to some sort of collective impact on the societal level? And I think there are a couple of dimensions. One is a scale dimension. There's a lot of pressure, and I experience it and agree with it to some extent, to get breadth. We need to reach out more. We work with small communities. I worked with small communities in Cyprus or in Georgia, and lots of change in that level, but does it reach other people? We need to reach out more and more and get some breadth. But there's also a risk of sacrificing depth, and that lesson came home to me. I worked with over 10 years with the same people and watched sort of the ebb and flow of their connection to the kinds of things that they were learning in the transformation. Sometimes you'd see tremendous change in how they were dealing with conflict, and sometimes you'd see people going back into the same old patterns. And so this is a very long journey, and it requires that sort of scale of depth, and sometimes that can be sacrificed in breadth. And so it's a hard balance, and so we need to think about, how do we balance those two, breadth and depth, and support them both. The other scale dimension, I think, is a linkages dimension between sort of vertical linkages between sort of grassroots and communities and the national level, and horizontal across the different sectors. And what we found in our own research at RPP is that, many of us work in one. We either work with key people or with kind of powerful sort of people who are key to the conflict, or we work very much in communities with people who, in order to build support for a peace process. Things, if they're not connected, if one doesn't link to the other, either way, peace processes tend to be less effective and less transformational. And so there's a challenge of how do we actually make those processes work? How do we then think, if we're working at a peace writ little level, to how we're going to connect to the peace writ large? We know also that it just doesn't add up by itself, that we need to think about it a little bit more. And some of the criteria that the program that I was running that emerged from practice that people were using might be helpful as intermediate, looking at, are we building processes, mechanisms, institutions in the broad sense of the word that really address the grievances that are and injustices that are driving conflict? Are people really taking ownership and really building their own initiatives? Are we supporting that? And is there some momentum? Are people's security and sense of security improved? Are group relationships, is there a meaningful improvement in group relationships? We can start thinking about those things. But if we're going to really think transformationally at the broad level, we need to think of both the scale balance issue and also how to promote those linkages. Next, I think fourth, and this has been an area where much of CDA has focused for now a long time. What's our roles and our best way as outsiders? And I put that in quotes. We can talk about what that means in the question and answer. But what is the best way we can provide support as outsiders? And what we found was that outsiders are appreciated. And particularly for the expertise and experience we bring from other places and from the outside. and for the support and accompaniment in spaces outsiders can open up for processes to happen. But there's also a danger of it risks, and I use John Paul Lederach's words from his speech at the Alliance for Peacebuilding conference, but often it's disembodied expertise. In other words, it's not contextual in this context, and it risks invisibilizing, as he said, local expertise, local knowledge, local experience and wisdom and capacities, and I think with some tremendous impacts on how effective we can be, whether people feel respected, and whether there's some real leadership developing and momentum developing locally, because it is people are they're the ones who are going to be driving this process going forward. And I can't tell you, and including in my own experience in Cyprus, how many times I've seen outsiders undermine some of these capacities. And so we need to figure out then, how can we listen better to people? How can we really listen, not through the lenses of our own expertise and our own ideologies, but listen to people? Can we be more present? And I think that's more difficult as we're growing, as access becomes difficult, as technology becomes more seductive in terms of having some distance and collecting information. And how can we take a stance of accompaniment and partnership, and see our role more as an accompaniment and support, rather than as providing an answer. And so I think that's a really important piece of just the way we end up doing our work. The second piece around conflict sensitivity has to do with, around outsiders, is around conflict sensitivity. And I think Marshall Wallace talked about it last year at Cyprus, about do no harm. So some of you probably have sort of had some discussions with him about that. But we all work on our projects, we work in our sector, and we may not be scanning the broader context to see how we affect it. And as the field has expanded, especially in the 1990s, development, human rights, humanitarian, private sector, which I'm spending much more time on, they're all become very critical actors in peace building. The sort of attention, the need for attention to unintended side effects on conflict has also grown. And we know in many ways do no harm has become part of the DNA of a lot of policy. But what we're seeing in practice is that there's still a long way to go to make it a reality and make it something that's implemented. And I will say, because peace builders often think of themselves as exempt, yes, even peace building can do harm. If the structure of a dialogue reflects the perspective of one side of the conflict on the conflict, it also can do the same kind of harm as a development one action that might bring resources to one side or another. And so the question is not, so there's a question about how do we minimize some of those negative effects. But I think there's a bigger question, particularly as we start talking about sort of the bridge between technology and peace building of there is a need to innovate. Conflict is evolving. There's lots of urban violence that we're really starting to deal with. Looking at the whole, and I put it in quotes, countering violent extremism, line of programming and the kinds of challenges that we're facing. So we're needing to have some innovation and develop new approaches to new dynamics and elements while minimizing harm but not feeling paralyzed. So how do we go forward and find new ways of actually adapting some of these important principles, lenses, and tools to be able to do this in a very kind of systematic and reflective way. So I'll conclude with a couple of things and then turn over to Bruno. One is the sort of that we're often not helped, and we know that because we, at least in the peace building field, we complain about it all the time, about the funding agencies. We're stuck in a certain mode of how we engage in this field. In a project mode, there's short time frames, there are emphasis on outcomes, emphasis on best practice and efficiency, competition for funds, and there's been a tremendous professionalization of the field, some of which is good. I mean, I'm all for emphasis on really thinking about outcomes, what kinds of changes, and on being systematic and professional. But there are some downsides that we also, again, as we think about this in the transformation field, to think about, that we need to think about. What kinds of messages do we as a field send to those we're working with. If we're about how we deal with disagreement, about how we deal with competition, about how we deal with and manage conflict, and I say conflict in sort of the positive sense. Are we modeling the kinds of transformation and cooperation and ability to see the whole picture that we're asking and others to do? It's ended up in a lot of fragmentation and siloing, and then a sort of difficulty kind of adding up. And now there's a real need of dialogue for cross silos. So I'll end with looking at the security issue, because I know Bruno has also worked in the security field, partly ironically, because many of the initial conflict resolution and management approaches were developed really as responses to more power-based coercive diplomacy and sort of military solutions as alternative ways of resolving and managing and transforming conflict. And so we're coming back to this conversation now, sort of 25 years later, of really thinking about, are we securitizing aid? Is there a securitization of our efforts? How can transformation and some of these really deep principles of nonviolent and constructive transformation, and really looking at some of the quality of relationships, how do we bridge that with some of the security and coercive means that are also being used now? So in that sense, really a call for both some more dialogue, but also needing some innovative thinking about what the next challenge is around bridging some of that gap. So I will end there and hopefully have some conversation after Bruno looks at the technology aspect.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Diana. And I've already got a few questions lingering about how some of what you said is going to apply to some of the issues of transformation that I'm sure Bruno will touch on as well. But before we go to questions, let's hear from Bruno.
Can you hear me, Elena? Okay. We were having obviously some technical problems before. So yeah, so thank you, Elena, for inviting me. For me, it's an honor to be again part of the Build Peace event. And thank you, Diana. I have learned so much from you for the past few weeks. So yeah, I guess I could start by just going back 10 years ago and reminding how conflict zones used to be resource scarce. They were completely isolated from the rest of the world, and because of this lack of communications and of available fast response solutions, the results of those conflicts were catastrophic and with no future improvement on the way. And today the scenario is much richer. Technology is not only concentrated in North countries and continents anymore. And for the past few years, war zones have experienced this huge transformation. Right now, everybody has a telephone, or they have access to internet, or they can access through even a hotspot. Everybody can send SMS. They can express themselves through social media. Everybody uses social networks and communicates in real time with their friends and family. The point is, communication allowed a totally new social dynamic in these areas. Just a small example we have been seeing for the past year, 2 years, Syrian refugees have been using Google Maps and Facebook to get alive in safer places. If it wasn't for that, maybe casualties could have been much higher. So, okay, before I continue and get deeper, I want to just highlight that I'm not a peacekeeper. I have never been to a conflict zone, and I haven't worked directly with peacekeeping operations. I am just a software developer, and I work for this think tank called the Igarapé Institute. And we have been using technology to make people safer. So in Igarapé, we have developed in the past few years a few different data analysis and platform visualizations. We have, just as an example, I have analyzed how guns and ammunition are traded around the world. We have mapped the most dangerous countries in terms of homicides. We have mapped how safe children feel in low-income neighborhoods around the country. But the project I have been working the most is we have been testing body-worn cameras with police officers in Brazil and in South Africa. And for the past 3 years, we have collected all different types of information. So even though I'm not a peacekeeper, I did learn a little bit about some things over the past years. And the more I see, the more I understand how technology implementation, it does not work the same in different scenarios. And okay, so when we think about peace operations and technology, we instantly think about spying drones flying over our houses and collecting all this information for a possible enemy. And this actually might be a big fear, especially if you live in a conflict zone. Even though this might be at some level true, technology, it means so much more, and it is much more complex than just this very flat view. We have today this big set of different technologies with different approaches. Yes, there are of course drones with this very rich uses. They have been used for monitoring places, transporting medical supplies. They have been used to provide 3G and 4G hotspots in post-conflict areas, and a bunch of others. There are also games which have been developed to increase communication between different parts in a war. There are virtual reality simulators to present a different perspective of reality to a specific group, ethnicity, or religion. In refugee camps, just another example, we have phones and we have internet, but we have no income. So today there are new possibilities for people to work remotely and get paid online, which is a huge asset for refugees. And even though this is all amazing technology, we must remind that all the time, it is not a silver bullet. It cannot solve all the problems, and it is not all positive. Peace builders, officers in the security sector, and government, they must understand that technology implementation do not represent it as magical solution, and it is just an extra tool for this very complex scenario. Yes, it definitely gives a new way of working with a known problem, but it also can raise sensitive questions regarding especially ethical problems. It can bring power, but it can also bring vulnerability. At the same time, when citizens are using technology to bring peace, terrorists can use the same ones to organize their attacks. People can listen in, they can steal information. There's much exposure right now. People know who you are, where you are, and what you say. And peace building is under attack due to this exposure. Yes, these are all big problems, and we should all be concerned with them. But this cannot be a big stopper towards innovation. Yes, we should recognize all of them, all the possible problems in the reality we have, and still we have to find ways to control and predict and stop the risks. Because every innovation that comes is going to bring new risks that we were not prepared before. So yes, they are going to exist, but we have to know them, we have to talk about them very intensely, and we have to be prepared and be proactive towards them. So yeah, so technology has been this big wave of innovation. There are many hackathons, code initiatives, gaming different activities, etc. There are a lot happening right now, and maybe more. There are different technologies, they are applied in different scenarios. But I guess the big question I want to leave today is how well does it work in the real world? And yes, for most of these innovations, we do not yet have a lot of evidence. And even though most of them are enthusiastic projects with a lot of goodwill, there are not a lot of quantitative and qualitative studies over it. So, okay, so just to wrap it up very quickly, when I think about transformation, just going back to the theme of this conversation, I think transformation in technology and peace building must be at some level to be more mature in terms of the applicability and the efficiency of all the innovation. We got to start proving the benefits and how to achieve them. Also, as a second point, I believe that integration should be part of transformation. I have seen in the past few years several projects, several technological projects being developed by all these different institutions around the world that they were in fact very, very similar. And it feels like I have seen the same work being developed over and over again with just some customizations. And I do believe if they were working together, they could have a much higher scale. And in the end, yes, bring peace is all that matters. And I'm happy to go back to Helena and listen what people have to ask.
Thank you, Bruno. Thanks so much for your comments. It struck me as you were both speaking that you both, in a way, talked about how transformation can be both positive and negative. So, Diana, you talked about conflict sensitivity and the fact that peace builders are not exempt from conflict sensitivity. You know, a dialogue is not necessarily going to build peace if it's not structured the right way. And Bruno, you talked about how technology is not a silver bullet. So, giving access to people to tools that connect them doesn't necessarily mean that they will connect in a positive way. It can also mean that you are helping the recruitment by an armed group or whatever it is. So this idea of kind of the sensitivity around what kind of transformation we're facilitating, and that not any intervention is good, and what are the ethical questions we ask ourselves, I think is a very interesting point of contact between you. So before I open up to questions from the audience, I'm actually going to take the liberty of asking you a question myself. Diana, you spoke about this thing that you call, I really like that you called it peace writ little and peace writ large, and I thought it was kind of interesting, this idea that you can work with a small community on a small transformation that you sort of have more control over the design of, but how does that really impact structural changes? Also, how does it scale, and how do you scale it in a way that you increase breadth without losing depth? And so I wondered if I could ask you to comment, and maybe Bruno also you can add to it, about whether you think that there are ways that technology tools can be used to increase breadth without losing depth. And I will say from the outset that many people have actually commented that although technology can increase breadth, it is always at the expense of depth. So I wondered if you could make a comment about that.
And I'm interested to hear Bruno's thoughts on the technology, because I think that's a real challenge. But I do think, I mean, and I will say, even at the very beginning, and I'll come back to this, is that one of the very first contacts, and I will say I'm a technology immigrant, not a native, but one of the very first early dialogue programs I did was a group of young people who had actually started their dialogue online, and had sort of expanded and brought a number of people in, had never actually met each other, and called us up at some point to say, gee, I think we're ready to meet each other now. We've sort of gotten as far as we can with the technology. We're ready to meet each other and take it to the next depth. So that was very early on, and of course think is very different now than it was then. But I think it's instructive in looking at this a little bit as iterative, is that I think you need to think about the depth and the breadth at the same time. And I know sometimes the resource constraints make it very difficult and make it seem like a trade-off. But I think the technology can certainly there's the technology of just getting communication out, the technology of being able to take some of the experiences that people have in one place and have other people in other places that they seem isolated learn about them, and bring them into their own in-depth processes, can create some linkages that I think would be really interesting to explore, that both spread things, but also link them at the same time, but continue to allow some of these processes to go on. but then again, think about, and I look at some of Search for Common Grounds, looking at media and the technology they're using. Some of what they found was to look at that there were tremendous impacts, but looking these very broad radio, television, other kinds of broad but programs, but they were more reinforced if they were combined with things that went in depth and with dialogues. So I think there's actually tremendous synergy there to be happened so that these things can proceed together.
Thanks, Anna. Bruno, do you want to make a comment on that question as well?
Okay. Yeah, so me and Diana, we were, in one of our conversations, we were talking about transformation and what was the role of technology and how the communication would work, and how we could integrate with the use of new technology with the peace building operations, and still knowing that technology would not be the only problem solver, that it could not be applied in every place the same. And the most important than the technology would be the protocols being used by the people on the field, and how we would still need, even though we might have a great tool to help us to improve the monitoring, to make the peace building operation less expensive and easier to deploy, we would still need people to correctly use technology and apply it in the proper way. So yeah, in the end, I think the synergy between those two different areas is that one cannot live without each other. So we still need people to understand the needs of the area and the needs of the place, and how that technology could apply to that area or not, or if something else should be created for that specific scenario. I'm not sure if I actually answered your question, Helena. You can ask me to complement if you want.
I think you complicated the question, which is exactly the right kind of answer for this kind of dialogue. So I think that's wonderful. And I realized that before I gave it over to the answers, I didn't explain that if anybody in the audience wants to post a question, you should have a Q&A option visible in the Google Hangout, and you need to enter your question there so that I know to pass it on to the speakers, since you're not able to actually speak on the dialogue itself. So if you can type your question, then I'll be sure to read it out, and somebody just did. Fantastic. So actually, this is Jen Gaskell who's asking us. She says, one of the greatest potentials of new technologies is its ability to empower its users, linked to near ubiquity democratization of tech. Can that be guided? Is it compatible with the current model of external intervention in peace building? So I think this is an interesting question about the link in between empowering users and sort of participation from the grassroots up, and how that links to a more top-down external intervention approach to peace building, which we sometimes see in organizations. So I don't know who wants to take that on. It's a pretty big question. You don't need to answer it fully. You can just comment on it and complicate it if you like. Bruno, do you want to go first, since Diana went? Oh, or Diana just unmuted. So Diana,
I was going to say, Bruno, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first? It's a great question.
I think Bruno's shaking his head, so that's all you, okay. Diana.
All right. Is it compatible? I mean, I think there's a great potential. I mean, and we've seen the potential, I mean, in many places of the technology to sort of empower its users and sort of democratize. Though I do think, part of what we've seen is once you, there's a certain degree of self-organization, and then at some point things need some, I don't know, guiding might be actually a really good word that you use to sort of move that into then what's the next step. I mean, if we look at the Occupy movements, we look at the Arab Spring, we look at a number of things that have happened, the next step in terms of collective action becomes a lot more difficult. So I think some of the, I mean, and and I would not advocate for sort of top-down, but some of really thinking about how do we then support the emergence of some sort of organization that can move that into something that is then having a kind of collective strategy and moving forward on some agendas. Does pose some areas where there might be some synergy, but it does put a lot of pressure, I think, on external interveners to start listening to what people have to say, and it brings a lot of information in. I hope, and I haven't seen it yet, that a lot of these organizations have the capacity or the investment to actually take in and analyze and act on what they're hearing from feedback mechanisms that are put into place by humanitarian organizations, which generates huge amounts of sort of direct input from people who are using it to be able to do that, to some of the more self-organized materials. So I think there's a challenge there to be able to kind of figure out how to kind of take in all that information and do something with it that is then eventually supporting the capacity and the empowerment back of the users.
Thanks, Dana. Bruno, do you want to have a go at that as well?
Okay. So yeah, when I think about technology empowering its users, I think about communication improvements, I think about engagement, I think about crowdsourcing tools where people can register problems in their society, and they can collaborate to create, yes, more empowerment. If it can be guided, it's funny that it's interesting, that question, because who guides this information? Who manages this tool? Who's responsible for organizing this data? And who's responsible for all the security regarding the information? I don't know. I think it all depends on it also depends on the level of the applicability of this technology. If we are working with some institutional technology, what are the protocols we are using? If we are using a crowdsourcing independent tool, for instance, what's the security behind it, and what is the principles of the institution working behind it? I don't know. I think I'm going to have to leave the answer with a big question mark.
I like it. I like that you answer the questions with more questions every time. So to any of the viewers that are on there, I can see you're on there. So if you're still interested in asking a question, you should see a green button that says Ask a Question. And you can go ahead and click that and type the question in, and I'll make sure to ask it. In the meantime, I actually did have another question that I thought it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on, which is whether you could tell us a short story about transformation that you've experienced in your work. Just one specific story. We've talked a lot in theory and in general, and it would be lovely to hear just a story from each of you. So Diana, would you like to go first?
Gee, I don't know where to start. There are many things. I mean, I think of it as very simple. As I think I said, I spent close to 25 years working on Cyprus, in and out, and met with many of the same people, many of whom are now, fortunately, negotiating the agreement. And I mean, at a big level, I've seen a huge transformation of how the process has happened, which has been gratifying. Of something that was very top down between three people and a fairly limited number of sort of options, to something that is much more extensive. Some of the best ideas that have come ever in the process over the last 40 years, even if they're not be all great, and more engagement, though there can be more. So just even looking at that, and there's not one thing that's responsible for it, but I see some of the work that has been done by a number of different peace builders as having pushed the process in that direction. But at a much more personal level, when I first started, I mean, many of these people had never seen each other in 30 years or never seen anybody of the other side. And so you'd bring people together and, you know, they'd ask her, do you actually eat the same food that we eat? This is a small island. And to really see them be able to listen to each other's stories. And I do remember I was doing some work in the late 90s with a group of young women, people who were working with vulnerable women. And it was actually in 2003, and the line had just opened, and many Greek Cypriots were very reluctant to go across to the Turkish side. And so around day 3 or 4 of this workshop, you see the tension rise, as so many of them, we were going back and forth for lunch. And finally, one young woman, we were discussing something, and finally one young woman looks and says, I think I finally have the language and approach so that I can express my concern to you. And she then proceeded just beautifully to say, look, here's how what is happening has impacted me. And it hurts me that people aren't willing to come and see my home and see on my other side. And it turned out that one of the women in the group had been raped during the 74 events. And it turned into a tremendous feeling. She ended up going across with tremendous support, and it changed the whole relationship among all of them, but allowed them also to get into very, very, very deep issues and talk about them constructively. And I remember that just by looking at both the transformation of the conversation, but also how they felt about both the event, but also about each other.
Thanks, Diana. That's a lovely story. Bruno, would you like to share one as well?
Of course. So in our institute, we have been working with body-worn cameras, as I said, and we, even though this might not be a big transformation, we have already a few anecdotes with some small pilots of police officers using the camera in their favor, and not seeing it as a threatening privacy tool. And we also have already had cases where they got a small infraction and they had the proof in the camera, and it actually showed them how they can validate their work and with this tool. And it also had proved already to decrease the use of force of police officers on the ground. So yes, we have some of these anecdotes already, but it's interesting to see how the security institutions are changing their minds about technology and their importance, and especially regarding open source solutions. So in our institution, we have started working with firemen in the south of Brazil, and they are strong appliers of open source free technology. So we started collaborating because of this project. So the big change we have been seeing is the communication and integration between different institutions for the past few years, especially the ones that are more focused on improving the technological side, even though they might not necessarily have a big budget for that. So the importance of technology had been growing, and people have started collecting metrics. But as I said, it's still very initial, and I think this is the story I have. It's the improvement of this knowledge of how technology is important, how it not necessarily has to be amazingly expensive and only proprietary solutions.
Thank you. Thanks, Bruno. Two very different, but very illustrative examples of transformation in both of your experiences. We've got a couple more questions that have come in from the audience. So I'm going to read one from Eric Seagal, who asks, do you know if there is any big governmental EU or UN agency that is exploring the use of technology in peace building, or that has created a relevant branch or department? I guess a branch or department to look at technology and peace building. So if either of you want to go ahead and answer that, if you've heard of anything, I can make a mention about it as well.
Okay. So I remember a few years ago, the DPKO, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations of the UN, they were starting this council, this advisory council to obviously advise regarding how to apply new technology in peacekeeping operations. I'm not sure of how that evolved for the past few years, but this might be one institution and one department that you might want to research a little bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, Helena, you may know better on my end. I know USAID has actually explored looking at technology a lot in feedback mechanisms for especially humanitarian aid, but not just humanitarian aid. And there's been some research done by some of the big NGOs using particularly mobile phones on community-driven reconstruction and various other kinds of things. I'm not sure how systematic it is. And you may know, Helena, whether there are sort of departments that are really pulling that together, whether these are sort of isolated efforts within these organizations. But those are two that I know of.
Yeah, just to add to what you both said, Diana, I think you're absolutely right to say that there's been more emphasis on uses of technology for humanitarian response than there is for peace building, strictly speaking. So UNICEF has an innovation lab. I believe the ICRC has some kind of innovation program. So there are, I think, more humanitarian institutions that are looking at uses of technology. In terms of peace building, the only institution that I know has a dedicated department is the U.S. Institute of Peace, which started the Peace Tech Lab, I think maybe now 2 years ago. The Peace Tech Lab is actually now an independent 501c3, so NGO, but still very much linked to USIP. That's the only one that I know of. It's interesting to me that Eric asked about the EU specifically. We've actually just engaged on a piece of research with the London School of Economics, looking at whether the EU has any policies, not even any departments, just any policies on the use of technology for peace building. And the answer is, the very short answer is, there's very little that is specific to uses of technology in peace building right now. But I think there's a growing interest in it. So I think we could say, I don't think there's any big governmental organization that has something that looks specifically at technology and peace building, but it's probably coming if we look at what's happened with technology and humanitarian response. Actually, the other one I would mention is USAID has the Global Development Lab, which looks at innovation generally for development and has some things around governance and human rights which touch on peace building issues as well. So thanks, Eric, for that question. And we have a question, Diana, just for you from Chris Langdon. And Chris is saying, you refer to research by Search for Common Ground on linking radio and TV with more depth, e.g. through linked dialogue. Yeah, e.g. through linked dialogue. So the question is, how much evidence is available now on the success or failure of such integrated approaches linking media and/or technology and dialogue?
So Search for Common Ground has done pretty rigorous evaluation on their programs, and so I think some of their findings have been consistent, that they are highly successful, and they have their limitations in terms of how people translate that into behavior and move it into other parts of their lives. They had worked with, and they were pretty rigorous kind of experimental design in Burundi and Congo, which had some really, and I'm happy to post it somewhere, so what some of these articles are, some really interesting findings about how these radio programs affected people's attitudes and how they affected their behavior. So there's some clear evidence of their success, and I think they've come to some conclusions based on the evaluations and some of this research that there are some additional pieces that can actually reinforce the successes and move that from just sort of changes in attitudes to changes in really behavior and bring it back into context.
Thanks, Diana, for that. And since I just asked you a question, maybe we'll ask one for Bruno this time. So Bruno, the question to you is from Jen again, and she says, Diana spoke about short-term versus long-term changes and transformation, but tech tools evolve very rapidly. So Bruno, when you design tech for peace, is that something you take into account? How, if at all, is sustainability built into these processes?
That's a good question and also very hard to answer. Yeah, it happens very fast. For the past few years, even in one of our projects, we have seen how much work is necessary to keep it up with the changes in the field. What we have been trying to do is to develop it as incremental as we can, always keeping a very close connection and information exchange with the user, which are the officers and the community and the people who are directly accessed by that technology. So I guess we always have to think about how fast it changes, even if we work with devices that change all the time, operational systems that are updated all the time. We have to keep testing the tool. And you gotta something we learned for the past few years working with this project is that the end user, the people who are going to use it, first they gotta feel comfortable and they gotta believe in the technology and they gotta embrace and they gotta find it easy to use. Also, when I think about how sustainable it is, it's very important, if possible at all, to have also people from technology in the local institutions that are going to use it, and to continue the work after one ends the contract or the funding or any type of negotiation that is associated. And also thinking about how we could make easier and cheaper for people to evolve the tool. That's why we were using open source technology as much as we can, because it's free, because it's available, and people can evolve from there. And even if we only go to a certain stage, other institutions and other organizations and other communities, they can continue the work and can adapt to their own needs. So yeah, I guess the sustainability depends on how easy it is for people to continue the initial work.
Thanks, Bruno. And I know we're now officially over time, but we've still got a few questions. So I think I'm going to charge ahead and ask you these questions that have just come in. Ala Diab is asking, are there any examples of use of technology to bring the beneficiaries, target audience, to the table as co-designers in early stage implementation? Although she doesn't say it, I'm gonna guess, Bruno, that that's more a question to you than to Diana.
Okay. I may not remember a specific example right now, but for the past few months I have been reading a lot about local initiatives in countries in Africa and Asia, even in Latin America, with new initiatives involving technology. And most of those organizations, they are involving the end users and the community in the discussion. And much of these initiatives, they are also very collaborative initiatives. So yeah, there are a lot of people and there are a lot of institutions bringing the community to discussion and making them part of the creative table, which will develop this common solution.
Thanks, Bruno. And I would say also, if Ala, if you're interested in finding out more, we also run a fellows program, which is trying to look at how we can bring peace builders into the design process for technology tools that are going to support a peace building program. And one of the things we talk about is also the importance of bringing beneficiaries into that conversation quite early on. So I agree, it's something that's happening more and more. And so final question from Zach Tilton. He says, you both mentioned technology as having the ability to broaden participation, and Diana spoke to the role of outsiders in conflict transformation. So how can outsiders avoid actually limiting participation with unintentionally exclusive technology. And maybe Diana, since you didn't answer the last one, I'll ask you to have a stab at that if you can.
Okay, and I'll be short because that's a hugely important question. And I think part of what we need to do is evolve our conflict sensitivity tools and frameworks to be able to really help us analyze these questions before we start doing these things, and so we can start anticipating some of them. We can't anticipate everything, but that, and there are many other questions around this, around sort of how uses of technology to broaden participation and get feedback can also then reinforce certain hierarchies and certain power dynamics that we really need to pay a lot of attention to. And I think we're getting there, but there's still some work to do in evolving the tools.
Bruno, unless you have something, would you like to add to that response?
Yes, very fast. Again, I might not give a proper answer, and I might finalize with a question again. But I guess the way to avoid the scenario and understand how this technology behaves goes back again to how well we are analyzing its use and its degenerated data, and how well do we how well are we able to adapt the technology to the need, and not only forcing a specific tool to a scenario where it doesn't necessarily apply. So it goes back to how effective all those different technologies are in terms of solving this known problem, and how much do we know what works and it doesn't work, and what has to be customized and what has to be directed in the correct path.
Thank you, Bruno. And I feel like Zach did us a favor, because that question was kind of a perfect conclusion of bringing together your two perspectives on transformation and peace building and technology. And so we're going to close this online dialogue. For any of the viewers, if you are interested in hearing more from Bruno and from Diana, they will be at the Build Peace Conference, which is on September 9th, 10th, and 11th in Zurich. And they will be continuing their dialogue about what transformation means in peace building and in technology. And maybe, given how we ended this, we will delve a little bit deeper into how our conflict sensitivity toolkit needs to evolve to take into account some questions specifically around technology and empowerment. I feel like that was the big theme that started to come out. But we'll have time to prepare that. And if you want more information about the conference, just to remind you, our website is howtobuildpeace.org, and you can find more information there. Thank you so much, Bruno and Diana. That was very interesting. I'm sure all the viewers enjoyed it also. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Goodbye.